Paul, to put it very generally, is a YouTuber and commentator. However, to get a bit of a, let's say, comprehensive bio, I'm just going to read out his YouTube channel bio as an introduction to this episode. It starts off by saying, make centrism great again. I guess you need not a mega, but like a
Mecca, yeah. Well, I
mecca.
want to do make
Mecca.
enlightened centrism great again. So
What
Mecca
was that?
would be
Sorry.
the make enlightened centrism great again.
Ah,
Would be the Mecca one to give me a vowel that I can make a slogan out of. But
that could be
for
a
now, make
merch
centrism great
idea.
again will be good.
Yeah. For now, that could be
I
like
get it.
a merch idea.
Yeah.
And then you state on this channel, I upload videos that can more or less be described as cultural and political analysis. Just as importantly, I talk about my experiences as a person and how they inform my beliefs, and most importantly, my actions. Pause. Just a comment there. That's something I love about your channel. I think you always connect, let's say, so-called abstract theory into your own personal life.
Mm.
And I think
Mhm.
that's quite important, especially given that we are embodied physical beings and we aren't just ideas. So I just
Yes.
want to put that out there. I really appreciate that you do that. Even in the Vaush debate, you did talk about your experience with Jordan Peterson, which I'm hoping we could discuss today.
Mhm.
Anyway, I'll continue. I believe the best way to resist ideological extremism is by offering a better path forward through multidisciplinary majoritarianism. I'd be keen to kind of flesh out what that term means.
Sure.
This is a multifaceted attempt to reaffirm the beliefs that I think the southern majority of people still hold: a desire for unity, individualism, and common sense reforms of our decaying cultural and political institutions. I reached out to Paul, asking if he'd want to do a follow-up episode after his debate with Vaush. And the floor is yours, Paul. Just
Yeah. Well,
what
you
your
missed
thoughts
the
are.
last line of my YouTube bio.
The last line. Let me.
There's a line that you missed at the end.
I copied across. Oh, is this the part about you being a comedian for legal purposes?
For legal purposes, everything
Man,
I do is
I
comedy.
certainly, I certainly had to read that out. For legal
Yes,
purposes, this is a comedy channel, or
that's right.
should I say, for legal purposes, Paul is a comedian. So
Exactly.
don't
Everything
take
I do is
anything you say
satire.
seriously. It's just jokes.
Yes,
Or
to
even
any
just
people who may
giggles.
be offended or current or future employees, everything I do is comedy. So,
Yeah, because
yes.
you now use your real name, isn't it? The last time we spoke, you went by PF Young. I didn't even call you Paul. I was just calling you PF Young, I think. Or
Yeah, I think early on when I first uploaded the videos, I just used my real name. I mean, I'm Paul, and I've said my last name before. I just generally don't say it to add one more step in case anyone wants to dox me and send dead animals to my family. But no, I made a conscious decision. I didn't want to. PF Young is a channel name, and people can call me PF Young. But I always introduce myself as Paul, and it's actually interesting because um, usually uh, I do this. Paul PF. There. That's how I usually have my
were you
label on
sending me
my
a
name
message? Or
in Zoom. No, I changed it. My little name at the bottom, Paul, in
Paul PF
parentheses,
Young.
also known as PF.
Gotcha. There we
Exactly.
go. Yeah,
Because
yeah.
to your point about like I talk about my experiences, I am a real person here, and I don't like the idea of like I'm PF Young and I'm some sort of character that I'm not
Yeah,
when I'm
yeah.
not behind the camera, right? And so yeah, so there's a conscious element of that. I would just go by my full name if I wasn't worried about crazy people constantly trying to ruin everyone's life, but it's just one added
Yeah.
interesting thing.
Especially when you're on the internet, man. And I know, I mean, the other thing is, you're not a guy, I don't know, that does, let's say, well, I'm gonna assume this, innocuous tech reviews or something that's like, I don't know, lifestyle blogs. You in fact talk
Yeah,
about
it's
politics,
I talk about
on heated
controversial stuff.
topics. So it's quite controversial. So I
Right, right.
certainly good to take some measures. But yeah, as I said, the floor's yours. Paul, just I appreciate like a stream of consciousness. Just what are your thoughts on the Wash debate?
Sure. Well, it was interesting. So I went into that debate prepared for a wide range of potential outcomes. I did not know if Vaush was going to come out saying Jordan Peterson's a Nazi and so is this guy, and he was just going to start throwing dirt from the beginning. That was a potentiality. So I had to mentally prepare, like, I got to get ready to do that. I've watched plenty of Vaush's videos for like years. So I knew what he believed. Well, I knew what part of him believed. I knew what part of him professed on his videos. And I knew that, at his best, he's a very different person from who he is at his worst, right? Which, I
Perhaps
think
most
you
of
could
us.
say that for everyone, but for him, and when you have an online persona, I think that's amplified,
Mm.
that spread between who you really are and the character or the persona you play. Um, so yeah, I didn't know how it was going to go, so I had to prepare for a wide range of outcomes. And I'm not gonna lie, and I said this in my reflection, I was very nervous in the first couple minutes. My heart was beating like to the point where I was like, I might have to turn off the camera and
Mm.
take a lap or something because I might have a panic attack. Um, which was interesting. I knew I'd be nervous, but I guess when you're in the moment, it's different. And there was a strange element of, I watch Vaush again for years, and I see him on the camera talking, and then it was kind of a weird feeling for a minute where it's like he's responding to exactly. I'm on the camera next to him, and he's responding to what I'm saying. So it's
Yeah.
like it was you have the virtual screen, and then I was somehow engaged with it in a way that I wasn't before, even though it was the exact same format that I consume it in. So it was a very interesting. It was just an interesting uh, feeling and perception. But overall, I came at my goal. It was I didn't know what I had to approach this whole thing carefully because on the one hand, one could argue, what's the point of even engaging with someone like Vaush, right? There's the very cynical, like, okay, it would be, you know, I've watched him for a while and I want to argue with him about the stuff he said. He's got a big audience. It's nice to get that exposure. There's like those cynical reasons. But the reason of like, and not, I don't mean cynical as in those are non-factors. Those are just less than it's, it's ultimately more than about that. Um, it's like, do I come in with a bunch of quotes prepared to like pin him down and say, you said these things, and I can create a bunch of clippable moments of all the dumb, of me pulling up a quote directly at contradiction with what he said. Like, for example, I don't know how much you watch Vaush or the people watching
Oh,
watch.
just to, I guess, just to clarify, I am very
Sure.
much on Vaush's side politically, and I pretty much
Interesting.
watch. Yeah,
That's
yeah.
interesting.
I mean, if
That's
there's
so
any
funny.
way, the way to label myself probably would be, well, I'd probably call myself a Christian socialist, but I think
Okay.
more realistically, I'm a libertarian socialist. So
Wow.
politically, I'm
Interesting.
very much on Vaush's side, except
That's
probably the trans stuff, and some of his, I think, unwarranted criticisms of conservatives.
mhm.
But politically, I'm very much on his side.
Yeah. So you don't think that all conservatives are the equivalent of Ku Klux Klan members?
Absolutely not, mate. I can
Okay,
say
yeah, yeah, that's fair. You're
unequivocally,
politically from like a
yeah.
specific, like from a policy prescription on certain things. That makes sense. I mean, I would agree with him a lot
Yeah.
on certain policies. Um, okay, so yeah, so his drama with Shoe on Head
Oh yes.
about the
Okay.
Shoe on Head.
Full disclosure,
Yeah,
I
go ahead.
didn't follow the drama. I know it was a huge thing,
Okay,
but I didn't follow that bit. What I normally
yeah,
do is when there's when especially given that I live in Australia and it's hard to
mm,
keep up with what's going on in your country, man, because
sure,
bloody hell, man,
bro. It's hard to keep up
it's never
here.
ending. It's never ending. What like it's like I think I already told you this, but when America sneezes, the whole world gets a cold. So whatever happens in America just
Yeah,
kind of spreads
sure.
across, especially the Western
Hmm.
world. But whenever something let's say there's like a news item or something happens in America, I generally go to like Vaush. I generally go to, let's say, David Packman. So I'm gonna be totally upfront with you. I'm very biased. I normally go to
Hmm.
leftist channels because
That's
my
so
my
interesting. I would
politics.
not have gathered that from at least our last conversation, and but it speaks to people are different and have different perspectives, and we can still have a
Yeah, I mean,
conversation.
it's interesting because I don't know. It's this is where I'd really appreciate conversations like this.
Mhm.
In many issues, I'm agnostic. However, I'd say when it comes to politics and especially economics, I'm pretty much a socialist, almost a socialist, or to put it lightly, like a social democrat. And part of that is
Sure.
probably because I live in Australia, where look, man, like over here, the political parties. So we've got Labor and the Liberals. So the Liberals are a right wing party.
Yeah.
They're quite, they kind of have similar prescriptions in general. Like no one, if a politician comes here and says, let's get rid of Medicare, which is a public healthcare service,
Yep. That's
they'd
no go.
burn him at the stake. They'd
You have
never, that
mandatory
never happen.
voting in Australia,
What
right?
was that?
Don't you have mandatory
We
voting?
do, yes. I mean, look, some
Okay.
people just pay the fine. It's like a small amount. But I think that's a good thing, honestly. Like, even though I am quite cynical about democracy, and that's just my personal prejudice, I
Mhm.
do think it's a good thing. I think, oh, Peterson talks about this, that it's, in fact, like a civic duty if you're a part of a
Mhm. Mhm.
country.
Sure.
Yeah, sorry, I don't mean to
Yeah.
derail the
Well,
conversation.
yeah.
Back to your
This is well.
yeah.
So back to Shoe on Head. So for people who are not aware or kind of aware, Shoe on Head is an online influencer. She's like a She's a Bernie. She's like a female Bernie bro in the most stereotypical sense, right? She's like socialist, but she's got some, I would say, common sense perspectives on when it comes to culture. She broke or had a big hand in bringing the Balenciaga scandal to light,
Oh, yeah.
the whole thing about the children in the photo shoot with the very
Yeah,
questionable to put it lightly,
that was
uh,
morbid. Oh, man.
stuff.
Yeah.
Right. So she brought that to light and rightfully called it out as creepy, weird BS.
Yeah.
And of course, on the far left, there's a small minority of people who say that is like somehow bigoted to call out BDSM stuff with children because there's a whole history of like extreme queer, like kink type stuff is a form of revolutionary engagement with the world or some shit. There's some intellectual rationalization for why leather fetishism around children is somehow, this morally sophisticated belief. And Shoe on Head, like most people said,
Yeah, yeah.
bullshit. And a big chunk of the left got upset with Shoe on Head. And a big chunk of Vaush's audience got upset with Shoe on Head. So Vaush came out with this whole criticism of Shoe on Head saying, basically, Shoe, you gave fodder to far right activists to be transphobic and bigoted and all this stuff. But we're still friends because they're friends in real life. So what I could have done in that debate is I was prepared to do this if it got to the point where mud was being slung back and forth. But I was like, I'm not going to go in trying to instigate that. I could have said something effective. Hey, you know how you just labeled Jordan Peterson a fascist for these reasons? Explain to me right now, and I would just read off a quote. You said Shoe on Head is literally feeding fodder to far right homophobes, you know, and feeding into conspiracy. How does that not make Shoe on Head a fascist, but Jordan Peterson is a fascist? And that, there's all the drama of a big chunk of his audience doesn't like Shoe on Head for the reasons we just described because they think she's doing far right reactionary stuff somehow. They unironically refer to Shoe on Head as fascist. So the point of all that is, had it gone south, I would have been prepared, but I didn't want it to go south. I wanted to bring out the best in Vaush. That was my goal, was let me be as honest and authentic as possible, say what I believe to be true, and ask and talk to Vaush the person rather than the persona that has all these ideas that are, intellectually interesting and questionable. Um, and I wanted to get to the person. So what ended up happening is I ended up just kind of going with the flow of the conversation a bit more than I think I would have liked to on reflection, because I would have liked to have engaged directly with some of his critiques about, for example, moral anti-realism. We had that discussion about, well, what do you mean by evil? And I knew what he wanted to get into in that level of conversation, but I was kind of interested in sticking with well, look, we can have a discussion about what we mean by evil, but we're going to end up on this. We're going to both agree that the Nazis were evil. So, like, the conversation I want to have is more about, why do you call conservatives KKK members, and do you understand how that makes people feel and stuff like that, versus just engaging at the purely intellectual level of, here's why I don't think Here's morality and stuff. It would have been an interesting conversation though, because moral realism versus moral anti-realism is interesting. Um, one thing that factored into the whole debate was a lot of my friends were watching the debate live, and they're not people who are really interested in these topics, or some of them would barely even know who Jordan Peterson is, or even Karl Marx or anything like that. So there was a part of me that's like, I want to speak to someone who doesn't have, who doesn't even know what moral realism or anti-realism is, right? Which is most people, because most people have actual jobs and lives to live, and they don't have all this free time to obsess about philosophy and stuff. Which that's a cynical way of looking at things. Oftentimes, there are that what I just described is a subset of people. Arguably, philosophy is the most important thing because you know, we're all nested in philosophy. But
Mm.
but when it's just like, well, what is evil? Like, to the average person, it's just like, what kind of conversation is this? What do you mean? What it's like the Nazis were evil? Can we just start there and move forward? So, you know, I was sort of like, let me have the conversation that's more relevant here, which is, Vaush, do you understand why calling conservatives KKK members is not good, right? Independent of all this intellectual stuff. So there was that. The other thing I would have liked to have gone into is the cultural Marxism bit, and that again, that would have been the same thing. We're going to go deep into the intellectual stuff, and how relevant that is for people watching. How many minds would be changed that way? I'm not sure. My perspective is, you don't change people's minds by logic. You change people's minds by embodying authentic behavior, right? And that's what I was trying to do. I'm not coming in to dunk. I'm not coming in to beat you on the intellectual grounds. I'm coming in to articulate what my problem is with you, Vaush.
Mm.
And
Mm.
honestly, and give credit where credit is due, because and I've seen him give good advice, and he's a real person, and he's not this one-dimensional troll demon, as Jordan Peterson would say, right? So, and it's funny because I was talking to some people, and their opinion is, no, Vaush is like straight up evil, and like he's a bad faith, bad person. And I was like, that's so simplistic, and
Mm.
you're getting a narrow view. You're taking him at his worst, which is bad, and using that to him at his worst is him all the time. And I've just, from watching him over the years, know that that's not the case. And it's funny because you mentioned you said you agree with Vaush a lot. It's like, this is my point. I have a friend who's a big fan of Vaush from college, and the idea is like, if you, who in my opinion, I don't know you well at all really, but from the conversations we've had, more than reasonable person, I could easily see me hanging out with you and whatnot.
Oh, for sure,
If
man. If you're ever
how
in Melbourne, let's have a beer, bro.
Yeah, well, there you go. But like,
I shall introduce you to something called a chicken parma,
okay,
and you'd
sure,
want to
a
change.
Melbourne specialty.
It is. Well, I think it's an Australian thing, but in Melbourne it's huge. And
Got it.
I'm sure I'm going to convert you fully to an Australian. You're
Sure,
gonna denounce your American citizenship.
that's fair. I'll take it. I'll
Yeah.
take it.
Sorry. So anyway,
Well,
sorry to interrupt you. Keep
well,
going.
my point is,
Yeah.
how I don't like, you are not someone who I think would be a fan of someone who was genuinely evil or like a genuinely bad person, right? Like, if you were a fan of who's like David Duke, you would have a different personality, right?
Mm.
This interaction would not be going the way that it is. I mean, you can not to say that far right people can't be polite and can't hide their beliefs, but like, it's just the nature of it. Like, if you really believe some people were superior to others, then we wouldn't be having this conversation as equals, almost, right? So, my that's a roundabout way of saying, I wanted to bring out the best. I wanted to speak to the best part of Vaush, and I wanted to bring the best part of myself, and I was prepared to kind of go nuclear if need be, but that wasn't my goal. And I think part of the reason the debate didn't dig into the topics I would have liked to is partly because it was just that navigating that split. The first 20 minutes, I'm like, I don't know how this is going to go, right? And when I settled in, then it was kind of like, well, we're having more. It's almost like we're having more of a conversation of an exchange, and to force the debate into one topic or another then becomes a little unnatural, and that's not me being as authentic as I could otherwise be. But now that I've established some rapport with Vaush, if there's an opportunity to speak again, I would love to go into, for example, like cultural Marxism specifically, and just have a whole debate about that. And the last thing I'll say, it's interesting, when it came to the trans issues, I said specifically, anyone watching this, I'm willing to have a debate where we can pull up the studies in advance, send me one quality study that demonstrates the efficacy of medical transition in children. There are none. The reason I said I'm confident they don't exist is because I am confident they don't exist. And it's funny because that debate has 200,000 views or something. And I know for a fact there's a lot of Vaush orbiters and people who, if those studies existed, would be glad to take me up on that debate. And I've heard nothing yet so far because it doesn't exist. And so, um, the points that I wanted to make or felt were important to make were made, at least from my perspective. So, but yeah, that's my initial reflection and kind of on a pass through, I guess.
Yeah. Well, two points. The first thing is, I think, and I'm not trying to, I mean this sincerely. I'm not trying to like flatter you or anything.
Sure. I wouldn't mind if you were though, but go
Yeah,
ahead.
yeah, but no, but like sometimes flattering can be insincere, right? Because you
Yes,
say
I feel
nice
you.
things
Yeah.
for the sake of saying nice things.
Yeah.
Um, I think because you started off by kind of, let's say, with the caveat or the proviso that you in fact have personally been helped by Jordan Peterson, that you in fact, just leaving aside his politics, just practically applying, let's say his uh, psychological prescriptions or his self-help prescriptions have helped your life, that instantly built like a bridge, like a human bridge between Vosh and yourself. I'm not trying to be like, oh, now that means you both are just
Sure.
on the same page. In fact, look,
Yeah. Of course
this
not.
is where, again, you and I may disagree. I don't believe one can be a centrist. And I'll get into that a bit later.
Sure.
It's
Okay.
a
Yeah,
very
that'll be interesting.
theoretical, there's a very theoretical reason for that. And I get it
Sure.
from Slavoj Žižek, who I happen to be a big fan of. Like, I'd consider myself essentially a
As
Žižekian.
Zekian. Sure.
Yeah. The second point is, so I do want to give you credit for that. I am not a big fan of debates, man. To be honest, I generally, after a political debate, I come off feeling dispirited, feeling a bit cynical, feeling like both sides were just either, throwing mud at each other or just purely talking past each other. But this, for the first time after this debate, I felt good. Just leaving aside all the intellectualisms, I was like, that was a good conversation. Like this,
Mm.
there's this guy Paul who is someone I like. I enjoy his videos, and then there's this guy Vaush who I watch quite a lot now, and politically we align quite a lot. And I feel like there was a dialogue going, and correct me if I'm wrong, didn't even Wash say that towards the end of it that he in fact appreciated the conversation?
Yeah, yeah. It's funny, I didn't know this until afterward. The debate ended and then Vosh was still streaming on his side. And I found, as soon as the debate ended, he said something like, I actually really did enjoy talking to Paul. He's a real guy. Obviously he said what you said. Paul said up front he's emotionally invested in these issues,
Mm.
but he wasn't lying about it, which is like a step above all the. I think he said giggling frenetic liars that he normally argues with, who misrepresent their views and all that stuff. And yeah, and it's funny. So the first to the point about building a bridge, kind of at the beginning, acknowledging my biases. It's almost like from my perspective, the bar is so fucking. Forgive my French. The bar is so fucking low online, where just being honest, like, hey, the reason I spend all this time talking about topic X, Y, and Z is because it is personally not just interesting, but impactful to me in these ways. And for me, it's like, I went to therapy. And so I made that connection explicit of the topics I talk about versus why how it relates to me as a person. But it seems like just second nature almost of like, that like in most political debates, well, people wouldn't do that. They wouldn't say out front like, "Hey, I'm biased," and whatever. And I don't know, maybe certainly the online politics space, there's just a lot of people who are probably, and no names or anything, but probably a good chunk of them are narcissistic and only care about the money and care about the attention and would just as avidly argue for one side of the political spectrum as they would another. And so I think I totally understand when it's like I watch a political debate and it's just like, okay, this was pointless. But I just my thought is like, okay, if my parents or my friends or my family, or if they watch my video, would they think like this is a different person than who Paul is in real life? Then I failed somehow. It's a form of lie, right? And there's obviously nuance in like, you know, I'm not going to have a conversation exactly as I do in private as I would if I know 8,000 people are watching live and 200,000 people are going to see it. But for the most part, if I'm careful and conscious, I can have a pretty open, honest conversation. And so, yeah, I think the biggest issue online, and it's funny because we're in a generation where this is a challenge for us that other generations haven't faced before, is exactly how do you navigate the online persona versus who you really are, right? And some people do it by, some people say like, I don't want to talk about my private life. Like they're academics or people who do like video essays who are like, I'm a private person. I don't like talking about my life at all. I just like talking about the ideas, and that's fine, but that's limited, I think, in a significant degree, because how do I know? I don't know your motivations, right? You're just a disembodied voice that does a video essay. I don't know anything about why you're doing it. And how often I think it's important when you're evaluating the merits of like a political idea, you need to understand the motivations of the person purporting those ideas, right? So, like for a mathematic, someone teaching you calculus, doesn't matter if they're a sociopath or not. The math is the math. What they say can translate one to one. There's no bandwidth loss because they're a bad person. But when it comes to like political or psychological or philosophical ideas, it's the opposite. It's like it's all about the character, the philosophical temperament of the person putting forward the idea. So I'm always trying to operate at the level of, I am here not just on a screen talking about ideas. I'm a person, in a real life context coming into you in this moment. But to view it anything other than that, I think is dangerous and uninteresting and ineffective. If that makes sense.
No, I see what you're saying. I think I mostly agree. However, a part of me also. So you made the point previously that most people aren't interested in theory and philosophy. And
Yes.
I happen to be one of those weird guys that just likes reading philosophy, and
Same. Yes, me
and
too.
even kind of, yeah.
I've got Ian McGilchrist, Master and His
Oh
Emissary,
man,
like right here. It's
it's
a
a great
thick
book.
book.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Right. This is
I went through it
most people
last year.
and it perfectly intelligent people would go, that's kind of nerdy and whatever, and I'm not going to take it that any particular interest in it. And that's perfectly acceptable. That's exactly how I feel about like quantum physics, right? I'm not really that interested in theoretical physics. Maybe eventually I will be because it appears to be merging with religion and psychedelics, but that's a separate thing.
Yeah.
But
Well, I mean, that's where
yeah,
philosophy comes in. So the idea of like well, there are many definitions of philosophy, but one definition I like is what Viveki points out. You take all these different disciplines, so be it cognitive science or quantum physics or sociology, for God's sake, and you try to bridge and find connections between them, which is where I think an eclectic kind of thinker, again, one of my heroes, Zizek, does, where he connects all these different his kind of like his magnum opus. If you can see it, let me get it. In fact,
sure.
I'm slowly going through it. It's his book on Hegel. It's called Less Than Nothing by Zizek. It's just, look at that. It's a big boy. I'm still going through this, and like in this book, there's a chapter where he connects quantum physics with this Hegelian idea of he calls it the incompleteness of reality. And some people would find that bizarre because he also brings up, like pop culture movies like Batman and Harry Potter, while also bringing up
Sure.
quantum physics. So it's very
Sure.
interesting. But the,
Yeah, yeah.
but then I do think, and here's where maybe I sort of disagree with you, Paul.
Sure.
Is I still think it's important to focus on theory because I think thinking is quite necessary. And what I mean, so just to clarify that when I'm saying it's important to focus on theory, I'm not saying, oh, that means one is indifferent to it or apathetic to it. It's impossible. I don't think you could just be interested in theory without, in fact, being an embodied being with a life, with motivations, emotions,
Sure.
and all the. It's kind of like what Nietzsche said. Nietzsche famously said that uh, every philosophy is the biography of the philosopher. So for Nietzsche, philosophy doesn't just exist abstractly out there, which is why
Yeah.
he's like the proto
That's like
existential.
William James' philosophical temperaments, right? Like
Interesting.
philosophy is an extension of your
I'm not
personality.
familiar with
Yeah,
that.
that's there are different personalities project different philosophies. So like a super left-brained, to put it simply, kind of like engineer type person will have a very analytic Jeremy Bentham, I think it's rationalist philosophy. It's just pure abstract. And then there's the more empiricist side. Rationalism versus empiricism is his dichotomy, where it's like in the world, sensory type stuff versus at the abstract. So it's different philosophical personalities, temperaments. So that seems to line up with Nietzsche's claim that you just made.
Oh yeah, certainly. And here it's funny. Heidegger in one of his lectures on Aristotle famously said, Aristotle was a man that was born, he philosophized, and he died. That's all that matters. Nothing else about Aristotle matters. And I think what Heidegger was trying to do there was, in fact, say, forget about getting too kind of obsessed and building this kind of cult persona or Aristotle or whoever. Just focus on the theory. Just that's it, theory itself, nothing more, nothing less. Um, and the reason I say that that's still important is because, okay, this is a bit hard for me to articulate, but I'm going to try my best.
Sure.
So please
Please.
bear with me, Paul. I think we are making a mistake in contemporary society where we medicalize and psychologize everything. So that even a human being is reduced to, like you said, a dichotomy between
Machine. Yeah.
the left brain or right brain. And
Mm.
and I see the temptation to do that because, like, I'm a software engineer, that's my day job, and I love thinking analytically, and I love thinking in like a very systematic way, let's say. However, the more I've got into more deeper philosophy, like Lacan, for instance, like Lacan believes, for instance, that an authentic person doesn't exist. So like Lacan talks about this idea of he says that the way we form our desires is not by what we authentically want, but in fact the other, he calls it, the other tells us what to desire. And someone like Zizek connects that to consumerism and commodity fetishism and all
Sure.
that.
That sounds like Rene Girard mimesis too, which is something
Interesting.
I've gotten.
I'm not familiar. Let me.
I'm only just
Okay.
getting introduced into Girard, but yeah, Rene Girard mimesis, mimesis. That's the whole. All of
Um,
our desires are just other desires.
Other desires. How do I? How do
We
I?
desire what other people desire.
How do I spell that? M-I.
Rene Girard, G-I-R or
No, Gerard. No,
G-I-R-A-R-D.
I got Rene Gerard, but
Yeah, mimesis, mimesis, mimesis,
M.
and then
Gotcha. Yeah. So
which is different from mimetic, the Richard Dawkins idea, which is because it's
the
there's
memes,
mimetic
right?
from
Yeah.
the Girardian. Yeah, so there's mimetic from the Girardian point of view. Then there's mimetic from the Richard Dawkins point of view, which is like the word meme came from that. Mimesis in the Girardian point of view is different. Subtle distinction, but
No, but this is case in point. Here's what I mean. So what I'm trying to say is I do think it's important that we in fact sit down and think. Like so Zizek
yeah,
has this really good line. He and Zizek is a communist, right? So he's a leftist. He's a radical leftist, and he says,
yes,
what I would like is the day the revolution in V4 Vendetta. What happens after the revolution?
yes,
That's my
with a
terrible.
couple, with a couple
That's
in there too.
that's my
Yeah,
terrible Zizek impression.
yeah,
But
yeah,
the
yeah.
point he's trying to make is, and this is why I like him, because he's, as a leftist, he's challenging the left and he's asking, hey, okay, the revolution's great. It's the romantic feeling. Let's overthrow the system. But what happens the day after? And here's where he says theory and philosophy matters, where we don't say that, oh, let's just explain everything via psychology, or let's explain everything via neuroscience or cognitive science. Let's sit and think. And he even connects that to this idea called I would prefer not to. What he means by that is sometimes the greatest act of, let's say, subversion of the system is in fact not taking part in the system. It's saying,
Mhm.
no, I'm not going to buy that thing. I'm not going to buy the next generation of the iPhone or whatever, and not let the desire of the other affect my own desire, even though, again, not to get too technical, but Lacan would say that's impossible, that we are always desiring. Like what it means to be human is in
Yeah,
fact to
sure.
desire, which I
Right.
think I agree. And now maybe, Paul, if you don't mind, I could connect this to my point about fascism. So after listening to the debate for the, well, I kind of got this the first time, but I re-listened to it. Here's where I think where Vaush was coming from, and I'm keen to hear your thoughts.
Mhm.
So for Vaush, a fascist, where he defined fascism wasn't, he was being purely theoretical about it. As in, he wasn't trying to say a fascist is an evil person. He was trying to be, so the way I put it is that he was trying to get rid of the moral baggage of what fascism is and
Sure.
purely define it as a, let's say, a social structure, as a theoretical social structure, as a phenomena in society, as to how fascism comes to be, which is why he used Umberto Eco's list, which I think is a pretty good list, to be honest. Even though I take my definition of fascism more from Hannah Arendt's book, because I think
Sure.
she is a lot more comprehensive. And then what he was trying to say is, we think of, and you probably would agree with this because Jordan Peterson talks about this. Um, you think of fascist as some crazy, forgive me for being a bit racist, but like German speaking guy, this crazy
Yeah. Ich
guy
bin
who's
anwesend,
shouting.
seien Sie Brückenbüschken Fancies. Yeah.
That was a pretty good. That was
Yeah.
a pretty good. You even did that in the debate, didn't you, with
Yeah,
Vaush?
yeah,
I
yeah. The
remember.
fake German.
I thought you were actually speaking German
I
there.
know, I
Like,
know. It's
it
pretty good
was pretty
gibberish.
good.
Yeah.
And you think that this angry guy who looks like, you know the devil himself, but no, it's in fact, fascism is a social phenomena. It's
Mhm.
something that's rather banal, in fact, and all of us can be fascist if we have
Yeah.
a certain way of thinking, which is why I think it's important to study the phenomena as a sociologist should, and then try and lay down some kind of theory for it. Because if we
Mm.
don't have theory, then everything we leave to the whims of, let's say, emotion or psychology, or we overtly spiritualize it, which is another thing, another element of fascism. So again, just to reiterate, I'm sorry if I'm being a bit loquacious.
No.
The what I think what Vaush was trying to put forward is that, yes, of course, he certainly hates conservatives. You could see it vehemently, but he's also trying to state that, hey, fascism isn't something that was unique to the 20th century. It wasn't something that was just like this once in a moment thing in human history. It's in fact a recurring social phenomena which we can study theoretically, historically, and it's in fact rather naive and dangerous to think that, oh, it was those people that were the fascists, it was those crazy Germans, or the crazy Italians. It was in, but the social phenomena in the structure of society can emerge anytime. And he believes, and to a certain extent, I believe this too, that there's a kind of a, let's say, a resurrection, or there's another form of fascism that's coming into our society right now.
Mhm, mhm.
Case in point, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. I think they're in fact I think China is very much a fascist state. Uh,
Sure, sure.
so,
Canada seems to be going that way a little bit too,
well,
on
yes,
the
I know that
steps.
Peterson's been fighting a lot about that, but yeah, but you see the point, right? Which is kind of,
Yes.
because you think, Canada, oh, liberal democracy,
Right.
uh, but it
Yeah.
can still emerge. But anyway,
Yeah.
does that make sense? Sorry, I was trying my
Yeah,
best
no,
to
that all makes sense, and it's interesting.
clear that.
Yes. Um, well, I got a couple things. So first off, I absolutely understand and agree with the idea that fascism is not just as some mystical abstract idea. It can reemerge and is reemerging in many ways. That and maybe and again this this was partly a consequence of what conversation I was trying to have rather than not well, I didn't the conversation didn't go the way that we might have right now because it was a debate with there was all those other factors to consider. And I was again more interested in having the meta conversation about Vaush's conversation rather than on the topic itself. So what I would say is the idea that fascism is something that could reemerge is like that's the central idea in Jordan Peterson's work, right? I'm going to teach you that you would have been an Auschwitz prison guard had the same circumstances arisen in time. Every one of us contains within us the capacity for evil. The moment you say those people are uniquely bad, you are now exactly the kind of person who would do bad thing, the worst type of things, because you have no idea how you have no understanding of your own capability of evil, and therefore you have no way of preventing yourself from being tempted into that. So I believe that and I did say this more. I think I said this. I said fascism means bad person, and I meant in that the average person. That's what that means, right? Nazi means bad person to the average person, right? Nazi doesn't mean a National Socialist person from 1940s who was interested in the 15-point Nazi plan that Hitler laid out in 1933. Nazi just means Nazi equals bad, and it's an archetype,
Yeah,
right?
can I
Go ahead.
interrupt you for a bit there? Sorry, I know you were kind of going on a point there,
Yeah,
but
no, go ahead.
this is where I think Vaush, in fact, makes a good point because, you know, the average person who thinks Nazi means bad person, just or bad guy or
Yeah.
whoever, is wrong. And here's where theory comes in because
Well,
she's like, I mean,
yes.
of course, Nazi is a terrible. I mean, I've got to say this
Right,
all
right.
twice. Nazi
It's
is terrible.
complicated, right?
It's a
Because
nuanced
go
point
ahead.
because Zizek talks about this idea of Heinrich Himmler and Goebbels. These guys planned they architected the Holocaust, and at night they were listening to Wagner and Beethoven and
Yeah, and they were
enjoying
having
classical
dinner
music.
parties and
Yeah, they were
loving their
living a typical
kids.
bourgeois life, and you'd think, oh, look at these sophisticated, posh people, and they're very educated. How could they be Nazis? But that is in fact why I love again Hannah Arendt. I know I keep
Yeah,
going
yeah.
on about her, but she is one of my favorite political philosophers. It's that there are these structures that can give rise to fascism, which I think is what Vaush is more concerned about. And of course, he's got his own, personal proclivities to hate conservatives. That's a different story. But I think he
Yes, and
has
it's not
the
even, and
structure.
I think his persona hates conservatives. I don't believe he does personally. I think he plays the role of someone who hates conservatives, but he certainly doesn't. I bet if a conservative he met on the street, he would not treat them the way that he would treat a KKK member he met on the street. So I think that's a persona that he's playing and putting forward. But that's a separate issue. We could go into that now.
Probably. You may have a point. I mean, I've been having this thought about Peterson ever since he joined Daily Wire, to be honest, that he's now becoming this, call it up conservative guy, different to what he was when
Yeah,
he, prior to his fame, let's say.
certainly. Yeah. Well, because there's multiple doors open we could go down.
Yeah, I know. Look, man, this is, as I said, this was not supposed to be like a structured thing.
Yeah,
Free
yeah,
flow.
yeah.
Anywhere
Well,
with
there was. I'm trying to remember because there was one thing I wanted to say in particular. Banality of evil. Okay, so the point about the average person thinks fascist equals bad, but that is necessarily true. So here is where, and this it's life is full of paradoxes, and every day I'm
so
realizing I'm realizing that life is a paradox in and of
it's a,
itself.
it's a point
And
Zizek makes. He makes
yeah,
he says in this book, the only universal is conflict. The only
yes,
universal
okay,
is in
perfect,
fact
okay,
conflict.
perfect.
Yeah, yeah.
Because so is it true that Nazi equals bad person? They're more or less synonyms. Well, from a pragmatist perspective, uh, yeah, it's like saying, is it true that Satan equals bad?
Yeah,
It's
colloquially
like,
speaking.
yeah, it's like, well, is Satan bad? It's like, yes, Satan is bad. That's how everyone uses it. Something says this is a satanic act. That's bad.
Yeah.
But like Satan was an angel, right? And there's this whole complicated like thing of like, well, there's a hit. People are embodied. People act in the day-to-day world, and whether or not a statement is true is dependent on the behavior that it corresponds to. So like, and this is and the reason I said it's a whole paradox thing is like because pragmatism is all about truth as a function of utility. And so if people are using language in a certain way, then it is true then it's true in that sense. But like the whole Nazi is bad thing, it's like Nazis equal bad, yes. But you have the capacity to be a Nazi. So just saying it's bad people is wrong, or that bad is something outside of you and that you're
Hmm.
not capable of partaking yourself. That's wrong. And my goal and the way I approach this channel, and again, this is of course a comedy channel, so I say this as a joke, but the root of all comedy is truth.
Hmm.
Um, like sometimes certain discussions, it's just nerd shit. That's what I call it. So like for example, this is my favorite example I give. If someone's is it an objective fact that I'm wearing a black hoodie? Is that an objective fact? Well, to every person who is not ingrained in philosophy, the answer is duh,
Yes.
right? And you even asking that question, now I'm suspicious of you as a person because what kind of game are you trying to play, right?
Yeah. What's funny is, man, when you said nerd shit, and the moment you asked me that, I was in my head, I was like, well, it depends.
Well,
What
so this is the thing. So
my head
the
was
answer
going. Because
exactly,
I'm one of
well,
those
and that's
nerds that like
and I'm
philosophy.
in the nerd shit. That's what I'm saying. I am in the nerd shit as well. Because you could just as easily point out and say, well, colors technically do not exist in the exterior world, right? Colors are
It's
the
qualia.
experience, qualia, right? The experience of seeing, it's like the whole "your blue is my red"
Mm.
classic thought experiment. And and black is a bad example. We should use green. So I've got Sluthers of Catan over there. So that's green. For people who are red green colorblind, it's like that's a very practical example of like no, that actually isn't just green in and of itself. Or I don't actually know if they only see green or red or whatever how it works. But theoretically, if you couldn't see the color, it's not is it an objective fact that that's green even if there's people who literally don't perceive it? It gets complicated. So there's nuance, but now but like if the nuance forces you to say that it's not an objective fact that this is the color red, it's like you're speaking in a way that doesn't that most people just don't can't even understand or get behind, right? And so the whole when I was saying like Nazi equals bad person, fascism equals bad person, I was sort of approaching it from that perspective where it's like, yes, I'm aware there's nuance here, but the conversation that I'm trying to have is one that we can start with like whatever our definition of bad is, we're going to come to an agreement that Nazis are bad, or at least doing Nazi things are bad. Nazi activity is bad activity, right? Whether they're bad people, it gets nuanced. But doing things that Nazis do is the same as doing bad things. And it's not as simple as that. But because again, Vaush has a big audience, and when you get to the mass media perspective, I would say the simpler way of thinking about things is actually the more relevant way of thinking about things because that's how most people interpret it. Again, what is most of his audience? Probably like 15, 16-year-olds. They probably don't know the not that I know anything, but like they're not approaching these issues from a philosophically interesting, like, okay, how can we separate? It's just like, the conservative kid at my school who's bullying me is an asshole, and so this guy reinforces my perspective. And you could switch that around to the conservative side, where these
Certainly.
liberal pretentious assholes are, and now this conservative guy is telling me why all my liberal pretentious friends are assholes, so I like it, right? That's the plane that is more relevant because if society collapses, it will be at that level of analysis. It will be at that level of conversation that failed that will cause society to fall apart. It's not, well, we didn't properly articulate the differences between the objective reality and subjective reality. It's Nazis bad, communists bad, and we need to be able to, from people like me, whose fundamental goal is I'm trying to avoid the end of the world. That's one of my many fundamental goals. Like,
That's
let's
fair.
prevent
I mean,
society from
especially
right.
for a comedian, it's a laudable goal for a comedian.
Exactly. Yes. Right. And I'm doing it through and to that point, it's kind of like I need to. The theory is correct, and this is like conversations you and I are having are sort of my bread and butter, and that's what I live for. That I want to engage at this level. But when it comes to how do I go from this abstract conversation to how do I communicate this to someone who has to work all day to support a family and doesn't have time for all the stuff that I'm fortunate enough that I have time to dig into these books and all that stuff, right? And that's the approach I take on things for what it's worth. So that whole thing is I don't know. We encompassed a lot there.
No, no, no. I know that was
Explanation.
perfect. I think this is exactly what I was trying to get from you, Paul, as in
Sure.
not in like a manipulative way, but I was trying to
Sure.
clarity for
Yes.
clarity's sake, because I think I get it now. You see, I'm going to be totally upfront with you here. This is the goal of my channel is not. I don't care about saving the world. I don't care about even doing. I care about doing good, of course, like to a certain extent as a Christian. Why not?
Yeah.
But it's I'm purely interested in theory. Like I want to move my channel towards philosophy and theory, and then my other love, which is computer science. So now, but I can see, and correct me if I'm wrong here, please. Your goal isn't purely to talk about Jacques Derrida's
Absolutely
difference
not.
or episteme, and then
Yeah.
go on
Or
like a
even Jordan
double lecture
Peterson's.
about that.
Right. I will do heavy theory videos, right? That are like, yeah, I'm pulling from directly from a George Lakoff
Yeah,
cognitive neuroscience lecture. So
yeah.
I do that, but all of that is in the context of utility. Like I'm pulling all this theory for the purpose of making a moral prescription, maybe, right?
Okay, okay.
Or at least, even if that's not if I don't explicitly make that claim, which in those videos I often do, but sometimes I won't. But like, there is an element of it always comes back to why is this relevant, right? Versus sort of it sounds like, correct me if I'm wrong, you have sort of an aesthetic appreciation of the ideas and the theory themselves. There's just it's like art, where it's like there's something in and of itself that speaks to you. And
Correct.
and
I'm not
and
a pragmatist.
certainly, what's that?
I'm not a pragmatist. I don't do things for pragmatic
Sure.
reasons. I do.
Right,
I
right,
think
right.
you put it perfectly. Aesthetic appreciation. Like I
And
love.
and I yeah, and again, going back to paradoxes, like I'm not saying that I don't have that. That's not like, I love movies, and I love Star Wars universe and fantasy type worlds and stuff like that. And obviously, there's a huge aesthetic component of that.
Certainly.
But for me, the aesthetics are also a function of utility in some sense, where it's like I take the evolutionary perspective where you see a sunset, right? And we know from like a scientific perspective that a sunset in particular evokes a certain emotional response, um that like fosters cohesion and stuff. It like puts you in like a relaxed state of peace. And it's a in you can be a reductivist and say visual stimuli, emotional state. And so the aesthetic is serving a very functional purpose. But I kind of turn on the head, where it's not like it's not like the aesthetic is still fundamental, where it's like this emotional response is not just like, oh, it's just for survival. It's like, no, it's putting yourself in contact with the metaphysical foundation of reality, right? What does that sunset represent, or what does that sunset? I'm thinking
Oh
I'm
man,
falling apart here because
that's
it gets
okay.
so
That's what we're all
complicated.
doing. I mean,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, but for me, because I feel like I've always been more on the how does this relate to the thing in front. I hated philosophy up until about for freshman sophomore year of college, in part because I had friends who studied philosophy who were just intellectual masturbators, who would just string
Oh, I'm
together
one of
words.
those. I totally
Well, no,
admit.
you're not, because well, let me,
I
and
get turned
well,
on by this
at
stuff.
least at least you're not to the degree that
Okay, okay.
some of them were, because it was literally like poetry, where I would say something like, what is it to be in relationship to the object of our desire, and that the metaphysical reality of this, that, and it was like, it wasn't that you were saying anything. It was the act of putting together these complicated words in with some rhythm and some poet, and and that can be interesting from like poetry without explicitly saying anything is still interesting. But that's all that it was. Like, it wasn't helpful. Like philosophy wasn't, when I first encountered it in the way that I encountered it, it wasn't being used to elucidate anything. It wasn't being used to improve your life. It was just, here are all these abstract concepts. And I remember saying to my friend, like, it is such a privileged, arrogant thing to be able to sit back and say, what is the relationship between me and my consciousness and the objects around me? It's like, dude, there are people starving. There's shit we have to do. This is a waste of time. And now the reason I'm interested in philosophy is because, in order to be able to do those things, people are starving. Let's go address that. There's shit to do. You have to do philosophy to put yourself in the best position to be able to solve problems. So that's where I'm coming from. and it's a blend of both, but it sounds like you maybe are also on the, like, there's just something about the aesthetics of it, of being with a capital B. I remember first understanding that phrase was like, oh, that's cool. Like, independent of this didn't help me solve a problem or anything, but like, oh, being with a capital B is there's reality as it manifests in front of me, but then there's reality as I experience it, and there's that's an important distinction, but like there's something about that distinction that speaks to you, that's aesthetic, I guess, to some degree, and so I value that as well. But
Yeah,
yeah,
because in a way, Paul, and eh, forgive me if this comes the wrong way, you're kind of trying to do an impossible thing. Because it would be unfair to say, oh, all you like if someone says PF Young, your channel is a self-help channel. I mean, that's bizarre. It's not a self-help channel. No, it's not, just because you talk about, you in fact do talk about metaphysics and theory. You talk about archetype psychology, all of that, and that is very much, I believe, grounded in your aesthetic appreciation of these concepts. Though, yes, you also try and build a bridge. I don't know if that's a proper word, but you try and see how that can have a material impact on the world. And I think all philosophers do that. For instance, again, one of my hero, Zizek, he'll take Hegel's metaphysics or Hegel's lack of metaphysics, different conversation, and then Lacan's psychoanalysis, and then he takes a Marxist perspective and he connects them, and he finds a synthesis into the real world where there's political action and whatnot. So and that's where maybe now we could connect this back to the fascism bit, where
sure.
I kind of want to, maybe I want to make it like an episode in this conversation, so that I can kind of have it as like one flow.
Yep.
Let's say it's that. So Zizek was asked in one interview, what's the purpose of philosophy? And he said, oh, it's a difficult question to answer, but generally philosophy comes to salience in times of crisis, because philosophy isn't about giving solutions. It's in fact learning even how to formulate the questions. It's not even about giving the answers. It's about figuring out what questions to ask in the first place.
I like that. Yeah.
And I certainly, at a very pragmatic level, I agree with him there. Like I think philosophy isn't even about going and finding solutions. That can be done in different disciplines, like science, of course, or economics. There are many other disciplines where we could focus on solutions, on palpable material solutions, but that is not philosophy, and I think philosophy is the questions, which is why perhaps we could connect that to the fascism part, where, okay, so there are two thinkers here. There's Hannah Arendt, and then there's I keep forgetting the guy's name.
Umberto Eco.
Umberto Eco. His list. So when Vaush calls Peterson a fascist, he is it okay if we go there now to like kind of
Yeah.
a bit?
Yeah.
So just for the viewers, I'll put up the list on the screen. But I'll first read it out.
You could even it's up to you. You could share it with me now, so we're both looking at it. But
that's a good idea.
Also would,
yeah.
But if you don't want to have us be minimized, it's up to you.
That's a good idea. We could both then refer to the same point. That could work. The problem with being a nerd is, man, I've got multiple screens, and
I'm doing.
You see like a bar, the apps bar. Yeah. So let me zoom in. Yeah. So this is from Open Culture. I just found this list, but you could find it like on Wikipedia, wherever.
Sure.
And we could probably discuss this, and then if it's okay with you, there's also a small excerpt from Hannah Arendt's book that I'd like to read out.
Yeah.
So
definitely.
This is the list, in fact, that Vaush was referring to, and I think this is a pretty good list to define a fascist from a theoretical perspective. So there are 14 points here. I'm just going to firstly read out all 14. The cult of tradition, the rejection of modernism, the cult of action for action's sake, disagreement in treason, fear of difference, appeal to social frustration, the obsession with the plot. The enemy is both strong and weak. Pacifism is trafficking with the enemy. Contempt for the weak. Everybody is educated to become a hero. uh, what's that word?
Machismo.
Machismo and weaponry, selective populism. Fascism speaks newspeak, so it's like an Orwellian thing. Newspeak. So, firstly, Paul, let me just ask you up front: from these 14 points, if you were to give the devil his due, let's say, in this case, the devil is Vaush, Vaush, would you say is there a connection you can make to any of Peterson's work, his persona, even his Twitter, whatever he does publicly, from these 14 points?
Yeah, so I was looking over this prior to this conversation, and what stood out to me is a lot of these points are not just the descriptions of fascism, but the description of tyranny in general or authoritarianism, right? Now, it's funny because I think Vaush has claimed like Stalin was a fascist, right? So that to my point, it's like everyone who's Mao, Stalin, Nazis, fascism, what we normally think of as like kind of, the Nazis equal fascist, fascist is like a right-wing thing. And I'm pretty sure there's a lot of thinkers that would say that fascism is a right-wing phenomenon. I think Marcuse, that's like his central idea.
His list, yes, Adorno's list. Yeah, it's a right-wing phenomenon.
Yeah, it's inherently right-wing. Which means Stalin was right-wing, even though he called himself a communist. So we immediately get into the realm of, depending on how you define if fascism just means, like you said, CCP is fascist. It's like, well, they're communist, but I get your point. If we're going to define fascism in the way of like,
yeah, by the structure,
yeah. So, like cult of tradition, one only has to look at the syllabus of every fascist movement to find major traditionalist thinkers. The Nazi Gnosis was nourished by traditionalist, syncreticist, occult elements. So it's kind of like a matter of interpretation. So is anyone who appreciates tradition at risk of, are they somewhat fascist? So if I have a minor appreciation for tradition, if I get married and my wife takes my last name for no other reason than it's tradition,
okay,
is that, am I semi-fascist in that regard?
And I hope not. Well, I hope that's not. Well, I don't know if that's what Bosch will say, given that we're talking about, his, because he brought up it's the reason we're having this conversation is because of him. So I'm going to refer to him quite a lot here. But well, here's where I think of Peterson as falling into some, maybe let's take the cult of tradition, right? So partially from my understanding, I haven't got much of an understanding or like the details of this list by Umberto Eco, but Hannah Arendt certainly talks about this cult of tradition idea where she says, so Peterson says the West is in crisis from the postmodern neo-Marxists, or from these radical leftists, or from woke people. The West is in crisis, where we are going through a downfall in our civilization, and the idea is the cult of tradition. The way I read it is that we have all these crazy people that are creating havoc and chaos in society. We need to go back to something of more ordered, something more of a conservative way, where there was hierarchy and structure, where men knew what men were, women knew what women were, everybody had a place, a role. And for me, that's fascist. When the moment we start prescribing on how individuals should fit into a certain, let's say we prescribe how people should live their lives within broader society, and we say you have a place. So it's funny, Nietzsche, who's a proto postmodernist, in fact believed in hierarchy. He said that everybody has a place. There are the masters and slaves. There are some people Ubermensch, exactly. Some people fit in the hierarchy, and which the irony there is, of course, that he was a postmodernist. He didn't believe in any objective morality, none of that. He didn't even he believed that we should reject tradition. But
he called Christianity slave morality, didn't he?
Slave morality, exactly. And he said he believes that Christianity was the worst thing that happened to the West, which I vehemently disagree with him on. But anyway, sorry, I'm going all over the place here. The idea of, for me, the cult of tradition is where, to put it very very plainly, when people say, "Oh, the good old days where, where there was monogamy, where there was, men and women got married, where, people all went to church, everybody knew their place in society, but now we live in this chaotic times." Firstly, I don't think the good old days existed ever. There's never been the good old days, in my opinion. I think, in some sense, I'm here very much a Jajakian, where the only universal is conflict.
Hmm.
Society is forever going through this antagonism, let's say. But when Peterson does those kinds of prescriptions, I do think, I'm not gonna. That's, for me, that's not fascism, but I think there are elements of fascism that can come through him saying people should find their place in society, if that
Well,
makes
so
sense.
okay, so that we could have a whole interesting conversation on that point, I think, because I so I'm not sure what the difference between you said like you said people what people how people should live their life in a social hierarchy,
Correct.
is
Or
close to fascism.
perhaps, yeah, perhaps
Or
where,
prescribing their place in that society.
yeah, that's probably a better way of putting it. Yeah.
So, okay, so let me complicate that because I would say, for example, children obey their parents. Is that fascistic?
Well, to a certain extent, I would say yes. I mean, this is where things get a bit iffy, and we go on the nerd theory shit.
Right, which is fine. I'm happy. We're here for that. This is
Yeah,
not, there
yeah,
are not
because this is like, I
two
mean,
hundred thousand people will not see this. So, it's not about appealing to the masses. It's
no,
about, we're
not
just,
not at all, man. Like, I just want us to purely speak about theory today, if you don't mind. And I know
sure.
you
Well,
love this stuff, so I
yeah,
don't feel guilty for doing so. For
that's,
putting
no,
it
totally,
to
totally. Okay, so
yourself.
to that point,
Yeah.
children obey their parents is, it's, at least in this regard, there's some element of fascism to it. And it's like, okay, then this is where this is where, equivocation aside, because we're not having a debate and it's not to a thing, then fascism isn't a bad thing if that's the case, or at least like, or at least the lack of fascism is a bad thing, because if
Hmm.
if children should obey their parents is fascistic, like there's no society that's ever existed that isn't at least somewhat fascistic, because every society, children obey their parents, it differs what age and all that stuff, but and in Christianity too, right? Christianity is like, there's a whole honor your mother and father type
Yeah, submission is a big part of
injunction.
Christianity. Yes.
Yeah, so I guess, how do you think about, like, do you think fascism is bad? And that's just, so that's too simple of a question, obviously, but I guess, even if we're just talking about intellectually, is fascism purely descriptive, or is there some, it's there's an implication that it's a negative thing, right?
That's a good point. I would say, intellectually, and here's where I'm very much going back into philosophy. It is purely descriptive. Whereas the,
Interesting.
the prescriptive element, okay, I would say, okay, Hannah Arendt's different. She certainly makes moral claims in the book, like in Origins of Totalitarianism. She certainly makes moral claims, and and for good reason, given that she was a Jew in Germany, and she was exiled when the Nazis came into power. So she has a right to make moral claims, but as at an intellectual
Yeah.
level, I would say it has that kind of, here's where I think the descriptive element matters, because so a list like this theory, let's say, is in some sense the canary in the coal mine. It's an harbinger of what's to come. It's a way of analyzing and making sense of reality via a theoretical framework. Therefore, if for example, if I say yes, forcing children to listen to their parents, even though, look, I'm not a father yet. I'd like to be one. I would certainly want my kids to listen to me to a certain extent.
Right.
Not all that much, but
Sure.
I want
Definitely
them.
not
I want them to
completely.
be.
Yeah. If they're
Yeah,
just
I want
mindless
them to be
puppets,
rebels
that's
too.
bad. Yeah.
Yeah, because then they kind of become like cucks,
Yeah. Yeah.
to use a technical term, like you gotta,
Yes.
you
To be
gotta,
technical. To the theory
you
we're at.
gotta, you gotta be able to sometimes break the rules a little bit.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And I don't know. So if I could connect this to something a bit more tangible, let's say, where we're getting way too abstract here, and I apologize, it's my nature, I can't
No, no
help
problem.
myself. Peterson always talks about clean your room, personal responsibility. Look what burdens of the world you want to take upon and live in life. And so it seems as if from his rhetoric, there's very little uh let's say dialogue or conversation about, in fact, no, not focusing on myself, not focusing on what I can do within the structure of society, but what about changing the structure of society itself? What about challenging these hierarchies itself? Because for
Mm.
me, that's essentially what leftism is. Leftism is, it's quite simple. It's simply wanting uh, to challenge the existing social hierarchies, or to a certain extent abolishing them, even
Sure.
though that's
So
perhaps an impossibility.
yes, I would say
Uh,
likely an impossibility,
yeah,
but
nonetheless, it's still challenge. It's this constant challenge of
sure,
existing
sure.
structures and social hierarchies.
Yeah, making hierarchies more equal, or
Yeah, yeah, or more
flattening
egalitarian.
them. Yeah. So, okay, on that point in particular, well, first off, I would say uh, a thorough reading of Peterson, I think would, what's the word? I think would absolve, not absolve. I think would banish that idea that you just put forward from your head,
Sure,
because
I would
one
agree
of
with that. Yeah.
yeah, it's a Petersonian meme almost, where his phrase is, "You need to do what's good for you, what's good for your family, what's good for the society, what's good for your community, what's good for society." Right? That's the I believe that's the highest form of Piagetian
It's
moral
a
development.
caricature. It's a caricature. Oh,
No. The Piaget is concerned with moral development, right? Like first you can like play with another child without having explicit rules.
mm.
Then you can play a game with explicit rules. And then the final stage, the highest order of moral development for human beings, is being able to generate new rules to new games. And another, that's a consequence of that is human beings can act in ways that are good for themselves and also good for their families and also good for their communities, and it just expands, right? There's and the fundamental Petersonian claim is like, your brain is wired to tell you when you're doing that, when you are most deeply meaningfully engaged with something, whether it's pursuing art or creating some code that's useful, or doing whatever. When you're developing yourself to the point where you can become the kind of person that's as good for yourself and society as you can be, you're adapted to that.
Mm.
And so the whole idea of like, hey, the reason that you pursue personal responsibility, the reason that you clean your room, is so that you put yourself in the position to be able to make those broad social changes, right? Because you need politicians, you need people that do that, that like he's a fan of Tolstoy and Martin Luther King and Gandhi and all that, right? It's like that was clearly all social action, you
Certainly.
know, collective action. And again, and this is funny, your point about centrism. I don't know if we'll have time to go over. I'm more than happy to do a separate thing just on centrism.
That would be really
You
interesting.
said
Yeah,
it's
I mean, I
you said
haven't
it's an
prepared for that, but I
impossibility.
have some theoretical reasons as to why I
Sure,
think
sure.
socialism is impossible. But
Well,
nonetheless, sorry to interrupt you.
sure. Well, just to preview what my at least argument would be, or my perspective is that the best elements of leftism and the best elements of conservatism are encapsulated in centrism, and it's just a matter of adapting to the circumstance. So, for example, leftism is, you said, it's about equalizing hierarchies and addressing corrupt social structures. It's like
Mm, mm,
there you and Peterson's whole point is, the whole reason there are people with personalities that we would describe as liberal is because that's a necessary function. You need people who when society is getting corrupt, which it always does because it always leads towards corruption, and the world is constantly changing, new technology is created, and the laws that you had in the past aren't going to apply, like with like AI, for example. We That clearly needs to be regulated, right? Or anything, the internet, free speech, like we still don't allow child abuse to be videotaped and distributed. Like that's not even a remotely contentious philosophical, well, for some people it might be a
mm.
remotely philosophically contentious issue, but for most people it's not, and rightfully so. And so why did I even bring that up? So you need people on the left who can say, hey, these traditions and these rules, if they can't just be, they have to be interpreted to the modern environment that we're in, and the process of that interpretation is inherently left wing.
Well put.
Where right, and then the conservative flip side would be like, hey, I know that you guys want to change all this shit, but we've been doing this shit for 2,000 years, and it turns out that all of these changes didn't consider why we were doing things for 2,000 years to begin with, right? Like, a good example is like this, like the sexual revolution. In the Victorian times, people were super prude and repressed their sexuality, and that was clearly unhealthy. Okay, so what was the flip side of that? The sexual revolution, the 60s, and all that. Well, okay, there's clear benefits to that. People are freer, and it's not constrictive, and people can, in principle, get compatibility with partners before they get married and stuff. There's all kinds of good reasons I think you can make. But what's the flip side of that? Well, you know how much sexual assault occurred at Woodstock? You know how much sexual assault occurred in the sexual liberation where, oh, we're just liberated. It's like, consent was not nearly as emphasized during the sexual revolution. And it's funny because the current sort of left-wing perspective on like consent and all that is sort of doubling back to the conservative part where it's like you need it's very no room for what is it for messing around. You need strict verbal consent on every
Post me
every
too.
move you make.
Yeah, it's pathetic.
Yeah,
I mean,
which is
anyone who's been with because I'm straight, I'm gonna be with a woman. I mean, who I don't think anyone's gonna go and be like, before you make out with the girl, hey, could you sign this piece of paper?
yeah, exactly. Well, dude, there's a Black Mirror episode
Yeah.
about like someone like, can you sign off all the consent forms of all the things we're about to do, or whatever. It's like some
That'd be great sex, mate. Yeah, imagine that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's all the mystery and
Yeah,
fun
that's the
and
foreplay.
risk.
Signing
Yeah,
consent forms. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So the whole point of that is to say the left is needed half the time or for half of the problems, and the conservatives are needed for the other half of the problems. And you have to adjudicate between both because the environment is shifting around you. And so I don't buy the idea that Peterson is anti-leftist in its most positive form. He's obviously anti-extreme leftist, just as he is extreme against extreme right-wing totalitarianism, right? I mean, his whole analysis of Nazi Germany and his whole thesis is like, this shit was bad, and I'm trying to, get everyone to understand how bad it was and how you could have easily played a part in bringing about that terrible situation, and why it's important to understand that so that we don't bring that about.
Yeah. Okay. So here's a follow-up question.
Yeah.
I think I mostly agree with what you said, but then, and forgive me for name dropping, but I've got to do this because I'm a nerd.
Do it again.
So if you ask someone like Derrida, let's say, what do you mean by okay? You ask from them, is truth objective? Perhaps what Derrida would say is, we got to question the question itself. He'll speak about the episteme, where can we even have that question, what structures do we have to ask that question? Like, that's how Derrida would pose that.
Which is funny. That's exactly what Peterson.
Question the
that's
question.
exactly. Yeah, there's a clip of Peterson doing that exact thing, where it's like, well, what do you mean by God? What do you mean by you? What do you mean by God? So that's funny because he does the same thing in some.
And
respect.
I think it's to a certain extent, I like that Peterson does that.
Yeah,
I don't know what I mean.
Give
by
the devil
God.
his due.
Yeah,
of course. Yeah. What? Yeah.
Yeah. Who knows what you mean by God? It's a difficult.
Yeah.
It's perhaps the question worth asking.
Right.
So
right.
The way I would connect that to this first point, the cult of tradition, is, so you said there are people in the left, people in the right, and we're trying to find the best of both worlds and kind of create this kind of synthesis, and then maybe come to a higher truth or a better way of life, something beyond something, let's even say morally better than what we have right now. But what if there can't be a synthesis? What if, in fact, there is this inherent conflict between what right-wing people believe or left-wing people believe? So case in point is to connect it to the gender issue, which you and Vaush went into deeply. What if fundamentally the people in the left or people, let's say, in the far left or the woke movement have a different idea of what gender is to conservatives, like a person, I'm sorry to say this, but I'm going to say I fucking hate Matt Walsh. He really does anger me.
He's a fascist. He's someone that I would describe as fascistic,
Yeah,
or
I mean, you
at
saw
the
his
very
whole
least
tweet
proto-fascistic.
about killing drug dealers. Like he tweeted
Yeah,
a beautiful airport in Singapore, and he was like, "We would have an
yeah.
airport like
This is
this
because
if we
we need to
killed
execute
people
drug
who smoke
dealers.
weed or something."
Yeah, yeah,
So I think, like, for example, he would easily fit into most points on this list. Easily, we wouldn't even
sure.
have to have this
He
conversation.
calls himself a fascist.
Theocratic fascist. So
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, haha, it's a joke. It's like, yeah, well, root of all jokes is
yeah, I
truth.
mean, correct, right? I mean, he's got 1 million followers. I don't think, I disagree with that kind of cynical thing where people say, oh, everything's a joke. No, man, sometimes the things you say. Recently, I don't know if you were familiar, Vaush, in fact, covered this, but that 16-year-old transgender girl, she was murdered in high school.
Yeah, in
Brianna,
England, right?
in England. I mean, so no, sometimes not everything is a joke. And
Yeah,
sometimes what you're trying to do is very much warranted and needed, where, yeah, you do try to take these theoretical concepts and connect them to real life, because there are real material impacts. Sorry, I'm going off on a tangent here.
no, no,
The
no.
point I'm trying to make is, so my question is, what if there is that inherent conflict? What do we do there?
Well, fair enough. I'd say we first identify, is that conflict because it's inherent, or is the conflict because of breakdown of communication? So, like you
Well,
gave the example of. Oh, go ahead.
Well, no, I would say, at a very conceptual level, it is just fundamentally inherent. So, I mean, communication is a complicated topic, but, like, for
Sure.
example, if let's say a leftist believes that gender is a social phenomena. So, speaking about people like Judith Butler, it's performativity, where what gender is a performance, or it's how we view
Yeah.
ourselves in the gaze or the perspective of the other. That's society, let's say,
Right.
for all intents and purposes. Whereas a person on the right would say, no, gender it's rooted in something more innate, objective, be it biology, or be it our hierarchies, or be it our traditions. Gender isn't something that's malleable. It is something. Well, you don't even have to say binary, but it is something that you just can't decide for yourself. How do we how do we reconcile these almost irreconcilable assertions or proclamations?
Yeah. Well, so my perspective is there are four different perspectives on every single issue, every single contention. There's four different
Interesting.
perspectives.
Yeah.
There's the far right perspective, which is incorrect. The far left perspective, which is incorrect. Then there's the reasonable left and the reasonable right perspective. So, like, as a side example, like abortion, the far right perspective is the moment a sperm fertilizes an egg, that's a human being. That's wrong. I don't. That doesn't make any sense to me. That's unintuitive. It's a silly position. The far left position is we can abort a child even after it's born. Okay, so those are the two extremes.
That's entire
Absurd.
society.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what's the correct left wing perspective? Um, the moment a sperm fertilizes an egg, it's not a human being. At some point, it does become a human being, but we have to allow abortion prior to for some time after the sperm being fertilized or the egg being fertilized, right? So there's some perspective where abortion should be allowed. That's a reasonable left wing perspective. And the reasonable right wing perspective is, at some point, that sperm, that fertilized egg, does become a human being, and we need to not allow abortion for that. So there's two far extremes, far right, far left. Those are wrong, and then the middle left and the middle right get synthesized. So I that's like and that's just one example. I believe you can take that approach on every single issue: immigration, abortion, and you can even, in a weird way, break it down to, like, if you have a personal disagreement with someone, like if you're in a relationship and there's some argument, you can use that map in the same way. It obviously doesn't apply because it's not like a political ideology, but every belief, there's too far of one. It's like the golden middle, right? Aristotelian mean, is that what it is? Right? There's
Hmm.
always middle way to evaluate any moral issue, right? So I don't actually. So you're saying, if it was the case that there's a fundamental irreconcilable difference between, broadly, the left or the right on a particular issue, how do we go about doing that? I would say, I don't believe reality is set up such that actually exists. I believe
Okay.
that
So we have
the irrec-
ontological differences. Okay,
yes, I
understood.
don't think I think to the degree that something appears to be an irreconcilable difference, and it's like, to your point, like to your credit, like we are in a very polarized state right now, which would very easily lead everyone to believe, of course, there's irreconcilable differences, duh. But I would say that fundamentally, I think, is a breakdown of communication, and the gender example, I think, is a good example because, like, gender and sex, I conceptualize as different. Gender is socially constructed, and sex is biological, male and female, and then masculine and feminine. Now, man and woman is just whatever, dude. If sometimes I'll refer to it biologically, and if I'm talking to a trans person, maybe I'll refer to them as whatever. It's just it's that's not a big enough deal to 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 die on a hill of how many use the words in this way. But certainly masculine and feminine, socially constructed spectrum, male and female is a binary. There's intersex, but for all intents and purposes, it's a binary, right? So the irreconcilable difference, I think, is just a, if we could get all the conservatives to agree, like, hey, you know how like Chuck Norris is a man, and who's a fucking super skinny kind of, how Mick Jagger is a man, like,
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah, how like they're both men, but Mick Jagger's a little bit, more kind of flamboyant and like
Similar. Yeah.
feminine,
Yeah.
and Chuck Norris is like, this kind of classic masculine type, whatever.
Yeah.
We can recognize that there's a spectrum in there, right? And it's influenced by, how they're raised and their culture and all that. Okay, boom. Masculinity and gender is a social construct, right? Okay. Sex is made so that the centrist job is to get conservatives to recognize that. Okay. And then to the leftists or the far left or whatever, say, hey, male and female, there's some variation, but like every possible, male and female are fundamental biological categories that are older than uh like billions, hundreds of millions of years old. Like plants have gametes, right? Plants have pollen and other, like, male and female are fundamental categories. And there's a lot of differences between males and females that are clearly biological and not socially constructed. And our socially constructed roles do have some correlate, like masculinity correlates to maleness, right? Like why are what if we're talking about gender roles, why are most of the physical labor jobs all men? Well, because males on average are stronger. So the socialized role of masculine being physical labor, physical, clearly has something to do with being male. But there's women who are strong as well. So there's no reason to have that social distinction be binary, even though the underlying biology that the social distinction is related to is binary, right? There's room to expand things. And also with technology, we decouple social roles from biology. So like as a male, I've never hunted, right? And if the world, all electricity went out tomorrow, I would starve. I'm not what would you say? The traditional male role of like hunting and all that shit is not something I engage in, because technology has decoupled the need for me to be a hunter versus I can go to the grocery store and I can do other things, right? So like clearly there's a social aspect, and the more technology we have and the more society changes, the more we can differentiate the gender role from the underlying biology, right? Like the birth control pill,
Mm.
right? Like, women, it would be much more difficult for women to travel the world in the ancient times, because there was no birth control and no tampons and no any and like any of that stuff. And it's like, I'm not a woman, but I bet if I asked most women, hey, if all tampons and birth control and all of that went away tomorrow, would that make your life more difficult in virtually every way? And be like, yes, it would. And so, you just think like that was the norm for 2,000 years. And it's like, okay, that's why women weren't, we're not leading armies as often, aside from not being able to fight. But it's like you're just weighed down by this biological burden that women have, that technology has been able to alleviate in a lot of ways. So anyway, that's a whole roundabout way of saying I don't believe that was one example of where I don't think there is an irreconcilable difference, and I ontologically disagree that there are such things as irreconcilable positions. Now there are people who are like there are people who are so far gone on either side that they are irreconcilable, and also like psychopathy exists.
Yeah, we're talking about
So
ontology. Yeah, we're talking at a yeah. I see that. Yeah, I think this is why, because like for me ontologically, I'm completely in the opposite side where I think essentially reality is a conflict. And this is where
mhm.
I'm even a Christian here, where there's a brokenness to reality. It's as if something went terribly wrong. In Christianity, we'd call it the fall. But
Right.
there's this. So for me, which is why I think, in fact, there's a Lacanian point. Truth is found in the conflict itself. And I don't think the conflict is ever reconciled, which is why here's where I'm sure you'd agree with me on this. I'm a strong believer in dialogue and conversation. Even if conversation can be heated and it can get ugly, I still believe we ought to converse at all times. And I'm a free speech absolutist. So okay. I think we kind of touched on the point a lot more than we should have, but I see that. I see that.
Yeah.
Here's the other thing I was thinking. Let's probably go, if you don't mind, Paul, to point number 5.
Sure.
Fear of difference. The first appeal of a fascist or prematurely fascist movements is an appeal against the intruders. Thus, fascism is racist by definition. I believe that's how you pronounce
Sure.
fascism.
Or
Whatever,
fascism.
this word,
Sure.
yeah. You see the word,
Yeah.
right?
Whatever it is.
So this is again, I don't mean to connect everything to the trans issue, but I feel like it's something that's just
It's a cultural touch point. It's
it's a
easy to
cultural touch point,
get
and
into that.
therefore it's just like an easy thing to point to. There's certainly society is fundamentally currently in a point of change. We have all these new ways of being. We have new ways of people expressing their gender, their sexuality. And I would say Peterson, for me at least, seems like he's touching into or at least he himself, which is quite ironic given that he is such a open person who focuses on philosophy and ideas all the time.
Mm-hmm.
He has this kind of, I wouldn't even call it like a spite or a hateful thing. It's not. I'm not trying to moralize it or put any kind
Sure.
of moral baggage, but he has this fear of difference of what's happening in the trans movement. And case in point is, I think a few months ago, Kyle Kolensky, again a person I really like, I watch him
Yeah.
all the time, Secular
Sure.
Talk,
Yep.
interviewed Peterson and asked him, would you ban trans or conversion surgery even for adults?
Yeah.
And
For adults. Yeah.
adults. And personally, for me, I would say unequivocally, no, I wouldn't. If you're
Yeah.
an
Me too.
adult,
Me too.
just do what you want to do.
Right.
But he said, I've got to think about it, because and here's where I think he was trying to play, daddy who's telling society how to be, like you should live this way, which is fine. Like, I mean, I think he's got, I believe this sincerely. I think he's trying to do what's right. He's got good, at least to the extent that one can have good intent. He does have good intent. And so do you think he unfortunately falls into this point here where he does have this kind of fear of difference, where the trans thing isn't just merely about free speech, it is something beyond that, to this idea of breaking down binaries, let's say?
Yeah, well, this and just FYI, maybe this is the last point we can wrap up on, and then because there's when we're done this conversation, I want to ask you something after we're done recording.
Absolutely, mate. Yeah,
But
sure.
maybe this is we can end here and have it
Sure,
be the
sure,
jump
sure.
point for another one. This goes back to the point about, again, I feel like this can be used to describe basically anything that is bad, where like fear of difference. That's a human universal. Doesn't matter, fascism or otherwise. That's like tribalism. These people are different from me. Different equals potential, but also danger.
I don't know if that's
Uh,
true though. When you say it's a human universal, sorry to interrupt you,
mhm,
because I
sure.
would say I am very much enamored by difference. Like my whole life is
Well,
about looking into difference. Like I constantly look into what's novel, what's new. I in fact get aesthetic pleasure from it. So
sure, but it's it's relative difference, right? So, for example, if I'm comparing two cars, a pickup truck and a Lamborghini. There's a lot of different, there's a lot of difference there, but they're both cars. And if I'm comparing two different cultures, a lot of difference there, but we have some common understanding. If like a psychopath who literally sees the world differently from you,
Mm.
it's like, how
Okay,
much
I see
difference
a
are you
point.
in?
I see a
You get what I'm
point.
saying? Like the
It's a
difference
very
to a certain,
practical point. I see that.
what I'm
Yeah.
saying? Yeah. So, and that's,
Mm.
you know, like we love to travel precisely because, and it's interesting because like, I think it's the opposite. We love to travel not because we like to experience different cultures, but because in the experience of the difference, we recognize our commonality, right? That wherever I go, people still love each other, and they eat and share meals and all that stuff. And it's kind of that the by exploring the differences, we have a deeper appreciation for our commonality. But if we truly went somewhere where it was different, like we're like, no, children are abused for fun and ritual here, there's a reason you'd be afraid of that, right?
Mm.
Um, so fear of difference, I think again, I think that's inherent, and it's it's like is, and but again, Peterson's whole thing is no, difference is where opportunity lies, right? Like you have to, get out, like the whole Abraham story, get out of your dad's tent, get out of your dad's basement, and go out into the world because chaos, slay the dragon to get the gold. You have to confront difference and fear, and you have to confront the unknown to bring about order. You have to make order out of the unknown, because if you're just in order all the time, you have nothing to. You just become stagnant.
Yeah. Okay.
So the fear of difference, but again, I also think, well, is the far left, the super gender ideologues, are they not also fear of difference from their orthodoxy, right? Like
Perhaps.
if they
Yeah.
had
Yeah.
a conservative Christian or a conservative Muslim or something, like wouldn't they be? Wait a second, this person has a very rigid uh appreciation for these traditions that we hold to be bad. So they would just, their fear would be just as much as anyone else's, right? That's why I'm saying it's a kind of universal.
So you're trying to, yeah, I see that. Yeah. I have a few points about
Yeah,
difference,
yeah,
but I think we're short on time. And you said you've got a
sure.
question to ask from me. But before you do ask that question, Paul, could I just request? I really want to read the excerpt out of the
Please do.
Hannah Arendt book because it's connected to a lot of the points here. It's connected to
Yeah,
point
yeah.
number 10. Um, so do you want to first ask me the question and then I'll read
Well,
it?
so I want to ask you something after
Sure,
we
man.
record, or after the recording's over, when we're done.
Oh,
It's
absolutely.
a
Absolutely.
logistical question unrelated to the
Oh yeah,
topic at hand.
absolutely. So anyway, there are a few other look. I'm not certainly saying from my point of view that Peterson perfectly aligns to all 14 of these points. That would be bizarre and insane. I'm just looking at a few points here and trying to view his work via this framework. And a big thing here's okay. This is going to be a difficult thing to articulate, but I'm going to try my best. So
Go for
bear
it.
with me, Paul. A big thing for him, which I was initially quite enamored by, this idea of strength. I've always appreciated strength, the appreciated competence, and this kind of being the best version of yourself, to use like a terrible cliche term. And the importance of putting yourself together and trying to, in some sense, be a god, just like aspire towards this highest ideal. And in many ways, he himself is very much enamored by the strongman persona. He loves people like Jocko or people like even Joe Rogan.
Joe Rogan. Yeah,
Joe Rogan's a complicated case, but
sure. We're all
nonetheless,
complicated. Yeah.
yeah, aren't we? Aren't we all? So the point Hannah Arendt makes, though, is Peterson, and in his book Maps of Meaning, I recall I read it a few years ago. He says the cause for totalitarianism or fascism, just to keep it within context, is apathy, indifference, this feeling of oh, I don't care, I'm not going to carry the world's burden and do something about it. But funny enough, though, Hannah Arendt makes the complete opposite point, and she says no, in fact, indifference by itself isn't a reason for fascism, or apathy by itself. So people just minding their own business, let's say, not caring about what's going on in the world, isn't a reason for fascism. But it's quite the contrary, the opposite, where it's people who think that they have to be this great person, this strong man, this hero who carries the burden of the world and lives this like Nietzschean life. Those are the people that end up becoming fascists. And so this just for this conversation, I read this a while back, but I had to like I did highlight the point so I could find it easily. This is the Penguin, the Penguin Modern Classics version. So page 100, page 410, from Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism. Great book. I recommend it. I recommend everyone should read it. It's a very easy read too. Like, she's a really good writer. So I'm not going to
page
read
410 though. Whew.
It is page 410. Yeah,
Easy,
I told you.
long,
Man,
but
I'm into this nerdy shit. You know that, right?
That's fair. That's
You
fair,
probably
that's fair.
already figured that out.
Right. That's fair.
But here's, so I'm not going to read the whole page. That'll take way too long. But there are two excerpts. The first is, she states, this is about what leads to totalitarianism. Now, this is in the context of post World War II. Indifference to public affairs, neutrality on political issues are in themselves no sufficient cause for the rise of totalitarian movements. So that's the point I made before. Indifference isn't particularly a bad thing. And then she goes on to explain that, but the problem though is, in fact, when she calls it the bourgeoisie society, the bourgeois society, when they start feeling some of the things enumerated in this list, things like the fear of difference, things like where's the other one? Not contempt for the weak, sorry, selective populism, where the majority of people are feeling threatened by these minorities. Like, it could be the LGBTQ folks, or migrants, or whoever. I don't think most people in the West are afraid of migrants. I would, let's just focus on the LGBTQ, that group. So, and then she says the bourgeois feel threatened by them, to their way of life, to their traditions. And therefore, what happens is they look for this strong man, this failure. And then she states, sorry, not this failure, this person who's gonna kind of embody all the burdens of the public and do something about it, like let's say even like a Trumpian figure. These bourgeois attitudes are very useful for those forms of dictatorship. So the attitudes she talks about is kind of what I described, this feeling of, oh, what's going on? We're living in uncertain times. Our way of life is being challenged. It's being destroyed by these outsiders, by the other. These bourgeois attitudes are very useful for these forms of dictatorship, in which, and here's the important point, a strong man takes upon himself the troublesome responsibility for the conduct of public affairs. They are positive hindrance to totalitarian movements which can tolerate bourgeois individualism no more than any kind of individualism. So the point she's trying to make is that the latter bit didn't really matter, but the point she's trying to make is, when the strong man feels the kind of burden of society, and is like, it plays this heroic role, almost messianic role, to save people, that is what leads to this cult personality. And she goes on to like mob rule and whatnot, and gives rise to a fascist like a Hitler, or like a Mussolini, or like a Matt Walsh sometimes. So anyway, just that's the point I'm trying to make here, because he does emphasize a lot on the importance of strength and the strong man and greatness. Do you think that, I'm not saying there's a direct correlation, but there's this like fine line where it could either inadvertently, let's say, lead to fascistic tendencies in society as a whole?
In Peterson's work or in Walsh?
Oh no, not. I don't care about Walsh. I in fact think he's just
Peterson's work.
Peterson's work.
Yeah. I agree. Yeah. So, and this is such an interesting topic because it gets into the archetypal structure of the human mind, where I believe, and I think it is the case, that to be human means you have within you a predisposal to respond to certain, what would you call it? Certain symbols and words and psychological content in a certain way. You are predisposed to respond to certain psychological content in a certain way. And the example of that would be exactly your point about strength. Why is it the case that all human beings would be wired for to admire strength inherently? Well, from an evolutionary perspective, the obvious reason would be you need strong people to keep you from getting eaten by, werewolves and all that shit, or not werewolves, but
Yeah.
well, metaphorically
Predators.
werewolves and all that.
Predators.
The
Yeah.
dragon.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
No, but hold on. Just
Go
to
ahead.
interrupt, mate. I think I didn't make myself clear. Hannah
Go,
Arendt
yeah, go ahead.
trying to make a naturalistic claim. Sorry, I can't talk today. I'm getting very kind of excited about this topic because this is something I've
Mhm.
thought about a lot. It's more
Sure.
she's in fact making a very Marxist point here, where despite she's not a Marxist, she's saying it's the bourgeois society. So that's essentially most of us
Yep.
who kind of have this individualistic way of life. They do things how they do things.
Yep.
And then when that way of life feels threatened, so it's not all human beings feel threatened by difference, or
Sure.
it's a certain
Okay.
kind of people, which is, let's say, the majority. I'm not
Yes.
saying that's the case, but just for all the intents and purposes, that when the majority feels threatened, a strong man comes into power, and there's this cult personality.
Sure.
Strong.
Yes. Yeah, that's fair. And I would tie that into what I said. So there's that universal element, there's the archetypal element where to be human means you are wired to respond to certain, content or behaviors or symbols. And I would say, and so recognizing that, so when it comes to, well, what happens when the middle class, what happens when my way of life gets threatened? It's like, if we can talk about this, like it's like the school shootings, right? You know how many, like in America, people view it as this epidemic. Wow, these, like in Uvalde and Newtown and all these different places, it's like, yeah, that's bad. Obviously, I don't feel any, unless you're a psychopath, you disagree. But you have to remember, like, that happens every day in Chicago and every day in these inner cities. You know how many kids are shot and people are shot every day and we don't hear about it. But as soon as the massacre occurs at a place that looks like where I would have gone to school, now it's a significant issue. And to me, that I don't know, that when you were describing what Hannah Arendt was saying, that evokes that kind of idea where, oh, now my school is getting shot up. That's not supposed to happen. Everything else, that just, I don't think about that. But now it's in the bourgeoisie kind of perspective. And yeah, it's like, so, in some sense, I just agree straight up. I think, yeah, I don't, because it is the people who have to live day to day and don't concern themselves with, that's the shootings are their way of life. So there's no tension that catalyzes some broader movement because that's just how they're in on the day to day. But yeah, when it's the bourgeoisie, so to speak, that gets
Yeah,
the
yeah.
privilege perspective that gets threatened, I can see
Because
that.
in many ways, what kind of saddens me is I think, unfortunately, Peterson's work has now just become a way to justify the status quo. It's become a way to justify the typical bourgeois way of life, which, as a leftist, and again, I'm biased here because I come from a left wing point of view. I'm
Mhm.
full on a leftist. Uh,
But
when
even that,
there's
like, because you're not fully a leftist, at least not in my definition, because you don't, if you don't buy into what I would regard as stereotypically leftist, like children, like KKK is, the conservatives are KKK and children. I don't know your perspective on children being allowed to transition. I'm very much against it.
yeah, that's a tough one, man. I mean, I am more on your side with that.
Right.
I
And
think
that's a function of
practically
just the
speaking,
medical
yeah.
literature. That's almost not even a philosophical discussion.
Exactly. Yeah, it's
Whether or not, what does the
pragmatically
empirical
speaking,
data
I
say?
think, yeah. Look, mate, like I when I was a
I
kid.
interrupted you. I interrupted you.
No, no, no. That's
You're,
that's totally fine. But I'm just to on your point. Like when I was
yeah,
a kid, I didn't even know, if I don't even know if I was real. Like it was probably my whole other traumatic, different thing. I need
sure,
to psychoanalyze myself. But
sure,
therefore,
sure, sure,
one should be. Yeah, I think I'm more on the idea of over there. Perhaps I'm a bit more conservative when it comes to children.
sure.
But especially when it comes to economics, I strongly believe in unions. I think most things should be public, and anyway, economically speaking, I'm certainly a leftist. Uh, and my problem though is that's why I was really keen to read out this excerpt from Hannah Arendt's book, because what she says is these people who feel threatened aren't she doesn't say everyone feels threatened. She's very specific to put it to, because she's a social philosopher, to a certain group of people, which is a majority, the bourgeoisie, so the bourgeois way of life. And and here's where, man, I get very, very kind of iffy. I would consider myself an anti-capitalist, even though I see capitalism has its merits too. And like when Peterson says, you know, you go and do your thing, like focus on your life, be great, build your business. But but here, at one point though, I think we should all go back to good old Christianity and be like, no, Ed, sometimes you shouldn't go and do your thing, even though your life is in shambles. You should probably go and live a life of service and do
Yeah.
what Christ did. Maybe live via Christian metaphysics. And
I don't know if you saw my critique of Jordan Peterson. It's called "Rest in Peace," or "We Need to Rescue Jordan Peterson from the Belly of the Whale."
I watched that. Yes, the
Yeah,
one.
my whole
With,
point was like, hey, I don't know if I mentioned it in that one, but I mentioned it somewhere
that,
where,
that was a good
yeah,
one.
it's like, hey, Peterson's really fallen into this, like, I'm an evil capitalist and I don't apologize about it. It's like, okay, well, that's a problem because there's problems with capitalism. And like, I think I'm gonna do a video on Eric Weinstein's Marxism, is what I'm gonna call it, something like that, where Eric
Ooh,
Weinstein has some very salient critiques of capitalism that are, map on to Marxism. They're not derived from Marxism per se, but it's like, so when you say you're anti-capitalist, I'm like, completely, maybe I wouldn't go so far as to use that term, but I'm certainly sympathetic to whatever you, for the same reasons that
I
you
would
are.
I would consider myself a post-capitalist. I think we live in
Sure, that's
post-capitalist
fair.
society where
Yes,
we have surplus value, and we need to figure out
yep,
how to make society more
yeah, and
egalitarian.
especially with AI coming, it's like,
Yeah,
man,
yeah,
last thing we need is more innovation. We need to figure out how to get this fixed.
yeah, and the reason, and again, here I'm very traditional. The reason I am that is because I'm a Christian. I believe in the teachings of Christ, that we in fact should base a society not a society that's transactional, but rather a society that's undergirded by love. Um, and here I'm very much a Christian, so and that's where I'm wondering. And look, Paul, I may be being a bit unfair, you know, with you here, because you certainly are true to what you proclaim, and you do criticize Peterson, like in that video, when you see he's wrong. But in some sense, by being kind of an apologist for Peterson, I wonder if you kind of miss out on that idea of, oh, he's just defending the status quo now. Like, he's critical of virtually everything. He's critical of Greta Thunberg's climate change book. He's critical of any
Yep.
kind of leftist movement that tries to make society a bit more egalitarian. It seems like, and maybe this happens since he joined Daily Wire. I don't know, but I think
Maybe. Yeah,
that's doing
I
him more
would.
harm than good.
Sure, I would push back on some of those. I don't think he's critical of every leftist movement because, again,
Fair enough.
I think he makes, in my opinion, the best intellectual philosophical case for why the left needs to exist. Right, like his case for why we need liberals is compelling even to conservatives, I think. Going back to that point about you need the left to be able to update the current structures to new environments. Yeah. So, but to your point, in my apologia for Jordan Peterson, I may be missing the degree to which he validates the status quo. Certainly possible. I mean, I know I'm biased, so first off, I know I'm dumb, so I'm missing things off that regard, and I know I'm biased, so I'm missing things on a whole nother. Yeah. So the idea of I'm missing things for sure. I don't, that point about I may be defending the stat, or could be defending the status quo too much. I would kind of push back and say the status quo needs to be defended to some degree. Status quo does not mean bad per se, even though, like, when we use that phrase, like, you're just defending the status quo, the obvious implication is that that's not a good thing. And the simple interpretation of why that is the case is, well, the status quo was, slavery was a thing, and then black people were being discriminated against, and then the status quo was women weren't getting right. So
Women couldn't vote.
this,
Yeah, yeah.
when people say the status quo, they're usually referring to the moral failings of our current society. But if the status quo just means like the current state, right? Or I don't know what actually the Latin, whatever that means, but like you could very easily say like, well, the status quo includes like the First Amendment, like we have free speech, that's status quo, so that needs to be defended, right? So
Fair
it's
enough.
it's a, it's a
Yeah.
back and forth in that
No, I
regard.
think I think I know Kyle, our mutual friend.
Well,
He's very much a fan of John Vakey, and here's where again,
Kyle Maxwell, yeah,
Carl Maxwell. Yeah,
yep.
you've had him on a couple of times, I
Yeah,
know.
yeah, yeah, definitely,
In fact, I
yes.
found you via his
Okay, that's right.
on
Yes, I was trying to
podcast.
remember how yeah we came in contact. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, and like, I know Kyle's a huge fan of John Vakey.
or Vakey, yes.
Vakey, and so Vakey has this idea of dialogos, which is I certainly I fall on that camp too. Where there's like there has to be this constant to and fro. But Viveki,
Mhm.
because he comes from like a kind of like a holistic perspective, he's like, oh, we all have a conversation. It's like we all sing Kumbaya, and it comes to like this higher truth. Now, I personally am I'm a Narcissian where I think it's this truth is found not in a higher truth itself, it's found in the conflict itself, and the conflict is ongoing. It'll never end. This is like
Yes, sure,
so
sure.
like the Hegel's idea. A lot of people mischaracterize Hegel, and I'm not saying I understand Hegel because I absolutely don't. But they say, oh, there's a thesis, a thesis, antithesis, and there's a synthesis, a
Yep.
sublation. Hegel doesn't say that. Hegel says, in fact, it's a ongoing thing where spirit unravels, where it's this. There's a thesis, antithesis, and there's a synthesis, and there's another thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So it's as if, and it kind of relates to what you're saying too, because the left and right have to be in conversation or sometimes conflict, hopefully without too much bloodshed or violence, that in fact that's reality itself. It's just that it's not some higher outcome. And okay, I'm going off on a rant here and
Sure.
kind of nutting out on Hegel,
No
but
worries.
one thing I think we can all agree is that point you made, that we're all equally ignorant, or as Vaush said in your debate, he said that most people are retards. But no, he's
Common
right.
man is retarded.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
he's
yeah.
right. But he's right. But he didn't go far enough.
Well, the way he implied it, I don't think was right. But the point, the charitable interpretation of that point, yes, we're all dumb.
Yeah,
To
yeah,
a
because
significant degree.
Zizek makes a really good point. He says, I'm not saying that there are these smart intellectuals and then there are these common people who are stupid. He's saying everyone's stupid, even the intellectuals
Yes,
are stupid. That's what,
yes,
and I agree
exactly.
with him. I agree with him.
Yeah.
And yeah, look, mate, I feel like we went a bit over the time. I hope you don't have anything
2 hours
else.
or so? No, no problem. I've got no other
Perfect.
obligations today that are
But
super time
I think
sensitive.
we did touch on, I don't know, personally for me, I wasn't planning to go through the whole list because that would be, I think, a waste of time. But I think we did, I don't know if you made, I wouldn't even call it progress, but we did clarify some points pertaining to fascism, at least from my point of view. But
Sure.
before I put words in your mouth, is there anything else that you want to elucidate or clarify, not just regarding to the fascism bit, but even
Yeah, yeah. Well, no, I
as
just
a
the
follow-up
most
to
interest.
Washington's debate? Yeah.
Yeah, well, on the debate, I think I what I said at the beginning, I think stands. But there's other stuff I might think, but in this conversation in particular, I was again, you being a Vaush fan and you being a self-described, pretty hard leftist or certainly economically and all that. And I would actually like economically, I'm pretty far. I don't do that many videos about economics. Um, but I think I might dip my toe into that to some degree. And so I certainly feel you there. But it was just interesting. Like prior to this, the last time we talked, I would not have characterized you as, or I would not have guessed that you were like a big Vaush fan or anything like that. And it just reaffirms my belief of like the attitude I went into that debate with of I'm going to speak to the best of Vaush, which in part is like I'm trying to speak to the good faith people who listen to him because there clearly are, right? If he was as bad as people say he is, people like you I don't think would be fans of him,
Oh,
right?
certainly, yeah.
Yeah. So, and I've like I said, I have a friend of mine who's a fan of his, and there's just no chance I'm just gonna he's a bad person because he likes bad people. Um, So that was so I enjoyed this. Yeah, it was interesting to elucidate that out, and I'm reaffirmed in my belief that I could have done things better, but I think the attitude that I went in was the right attitude, and so I appreciate it.
Yeah, but we could, turn the table, so to speak, and be,
Mm.
oh, Vaush's fans would see you, who I think you you were kind of like a great interlocutor for Vaush, let's say, where suddenly you were coming from the point of view, you were in a difficult place because you had to defend Peterson. It's always harder to defend a stance than to critique and find
Sure.
fault with a person or
Mhm.
a such a stance.
Especially when Peterson tweets so goddamn much and he says so many stupid things, right? Which,
Correct. Yeah, and he's everywhere, and he's in fact a chaotic guy. Like he's all
yeah.
over the
Oh,
place.
yeah.
He goes on all these
Yeah.
podcasts, so it's
Yeah.
not easy to do that. But then I would say, like for me personally, because I knew you prior to the Avosh debate, I knew you were a good bloke. But now, so-called radical leftist or whoever that's on Vosh's side that think all Peterson bros are these, like, I don't know, white
Yep.
supremacist,
Bad
right wing,
faith morons.
yeah,
Yeah.
idiots,
Yeah.
would probably have the same, let's say, I don't know, revelation or same kind of thoughts
Sure.
about Peterson's fans the way you did
Yeah.
about Wash's fans, and I'm
Exactly.
glad that there was that kind
Yeah.
of,
I got probably a dozen or so
bridge
comments
thrown. Yeah,
saying, yeah, hey, I'm a Vaush fan, but I really appreciated the conversation, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, that's good. That's a win as far as I'm concerned.
yeah,
So
awesome. Thanks a lot, Paul. I really appreciated this.
thank
As
you,
I
man.
said, man, I think you're a great bloke, and congrats on all the success you're having with your channel.
Appreciate
Recently
it.
hit 3,000 subscribers. Oh, man,
Yes.
I
Yes.
reckon
No.
you're gonna be at 5K, 10K in no time. Yeah, yeah.
Yes, we'll see. We'll see what kind of risks and responsibilities that opens up. So, but I'm willing to bear
That's
it.
the point. Yeah, the
But yeah.
responsibilities is certainly that comes along with great power, as they say in
Hmm.
Spider-Man.
Hmm.
That great philosopher. I
Yes.
haven't watched your video on the postmodern neo-Marxist, the recent
I
one
think
you
you'd like that
uploaded.
one.
I probably would, especially being a theory nerd. I'd take a look at
Hmm.
that. But
Yeah. It's
nah, mate.
very it's theory presented through it's theory presented through the lens of this is nerd shit, but we need to talk about it type stuff.
Because
So
it matters,
I'll
yeah.
leave it at that. It
I mean,
does, it does, it does.
that's
It
case
just
in
has to be
point there, right?
communicated
It
in
comes from the real world. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. It's just it's communicated in a way that's not your traditional, oh, this is how we talk about theory.
Well, you
No,
are a
this is
comedian after
comedy.
all. You are a comedian.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's why I put it in there.
All of
It's
this
all
is jokes. It's just shit.
everything. Life is a joke,
Life is a
It's the whole
joke, man.
thing.
Yeah, yeah. It's
Camus
all
was right.
absurd.
It's all absurd.
Yeah.
So,
All right, mate. Thanks. I think I'm gonna stop recording now and
yep, that works.
carry on. Yeah.
I'll cut it on my end.